So, Liam, why don't you introduce yourself and let us know what your platform is?
Thanks. I appreciate that. Hello to everyone. I'm Liam O'Mara. I'm a history professor who's running for Congress in the 42nd, which is Southwest Riverside County, so not too far from you. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I'll just start with a brief introduction, I guess, to who I am, since most of us will never have met, and then talk a little bit about some key priorities. So, the American dream is not dead, but it is dying, and it's being killed by a faulty economic consensus adopted in the 1970s and 80s. I'm running for Congress to revitalize and restore the promise of those bold progressive visions that built the middle class in the first place. For 40 years, living standards have been falling, but that period followed a prior 40-year stretch of unprecedented growth and prosperity. I think it's time to admit that we made a wrong turn and to outline a new direction that follows the data. And this is where a historian politician may be helpful. I was not born into, the middle class life. In fact, I am still, like so many Americans in my generation, relatively poor and in debt, struggling to make income match expenses. My origin story is solidly working class. Neither parent is a college graduate. My mother ran a child care center out of her home, so I grew up with an extra 12 kids in the house. My father was a marine clerk in the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. I followed my father onto the waterfront as a fourth-generation longshoreman, but by the time I stepped into those boots, the field was in sharp decline due to, automation and, Reagan's assault on the unions. So I split time between the port and working as a fry cook. But around age 30, I got the chance to attend college, becoming the first in my family to finish a degree. And accompanied by a frightening amount of debt, I was crazy enough to run straight through from a BA to MA to PhD. So after that, I could fall into my dream job. And today I'm still teaching bright young minds, working to inspire in them some of the passion I feel for this material. And I'm still wearing the steel toe boots and a union cap. I think being conscious of my origins has helped me to relate to the aspirations of my students, growing up as they are in an era of decline. My generation was the first in American history not to exceed its predecessor's economic success. The generations after me have sharply lower expectations. Now, the progressive model that brought impressive gains in the 50s and 60s, when the U.S. experienced its longest sustained economic boom, was in the 70s and 80s rejected in favor of a corporate-centered, trickle-down neoliberal model. And when all it needed was a little bit of refinement. It was a classic case for me of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. And it put us into a cycle of decline, which was predicted at the time in the 70s, and quite accurately, to lead to the development of a low-wage, low-growth economy. And we've been there ever since. You mentioned being a Bernie supporter. I am too, for probably some of the same reasons you are. After the Reagan Revolution, this neoliberalism became entrenched, and every succeeding U.S. administration has followed the same basic template, with the results of rising childhood poverty and infant mortality, literally declining lifespans and failing health. We have the 35th healthiest population in the world, and a healthcare system which the World Health Organization puts below the entire developed world. Whereas the war on poverty in the 60s and 70s saw the national rate decline by 10%, under Reaganomics it's risen considerably since. And in absolute terms, the number of people in poverty in the US is the highest ever recorded. Despite being the richest country in history, living standards in the US now rank around 17th in the world and falling rapidly, with crumbling infrastructure, an education system falling behind, and consumer debt hitting crisis levels. Home ownership increasingly out of reach. Too many people caught up in neoliberal insistence on a flexible workforce, which means full-time employment with good benefits and a pension has virtually disappeared in favor of part-timers working multiple jobs. And union membership, it's shrunk to lows not seen since before the Great Depression. Wages for Americans have, adjusted for inflation, actually declined. And this despite massively increased productivity. We're working harder and we're being paid less. And on top of that, automation continues to threaten jobs, with fully 47% of American jobs at risk of disappearing in the coming decades. So for me, in so many ways, I say we live in dangerous times, made all the worse because few people understand how the economy works or what it even means, much less the way the conditions of the last 4 decades are fueling a neo-fascist revival. Our ignorance of the forces pushing us into this crisis make us a bit akin to a frog in a water pot. The temperature's rising slowly and steadily, and if we're not careful, we're going to boil before most of us even know we're in trouble. I think it's time not only to articulate bold visions for the future, but to outline and express those visions in a way that can bring more of the working class back into the fold for us. And for me, that means running on the kind of populist message that used to let progressives and leftists dominate even the rural heartland of this country. I'm going to give you a few examples of what I mean. So, first, raise our incomes by getting them tied to productivity gains again. Quickest way to do that is to fix our regressive tax code and restore the incentives businesses once had to invest in the American worker instead of in stock buybacks and excessive CEO compensation. Next, flip the script on the Republican immigration story by getting people to understand that it has always been automation and productivity gains that threaten jobs, never immigrants. With 47% of our jobs on the line anyway, we'll need to figure out a way to tax the robots and provide a basic income for Americans. This will help to restore the competitiveness of a lot of jobs which today struggle to fill positions due to low compensation. And it'll eliminate poverty too, which seems a nice bonus. Once they can no longer blame immigrants for all our economic woes, we can get through a major overhaul of our immigration system and bring people out of the shadows, making these Americans in all but citizenship into normal taxpayers with the same protections, rights, and obligations as the rest of us. Speaking of rights, let's dismantle the surveillance state and restore a little privacy. If companies want to use our data, they ought to get permission from us and pay for the privilege. And if the government needs to know what we're doing, let it get a warrant, as used to be the norm. You know, innocent until proven guilty. And as to the guilty, let's fix our broken criminal justice system by scaling back on the victimless crimes like drug use and sex work and the like, and start regulating the existing industries so that safety can be ensured for all. We don't need to fill up prison cells with people who just want to get high in their living rooms and play video games. And what about our crumbling education system? Oh, it's a big one for me. California and the US used to lead the world in outcomes, and we still have many of the best universities in the world, but they're priced out of reach for most of us, leaving graduates with a mortgage-sized lodestone around their necks. Higher education used to be a path to the middle class, and it needs to be again. I'm for tuition-free public universities, colleges, and trade schools. I'm also for cancellation of student debt and argue that it would provide a massive economic stimulus for all of us by freeing up income for other spending. So it helps even the people that don't have the debt. We also need to increase, of course, federal spending on primary and secondary education. Teacher salaries are far too low, and none of them should have to be spending their own money on supplies for classes. And the schools should not be stuck with these permanent temporary trailers. I also think we need to eliminate the concept of student lunch debt and provide nutritious meals for all of our kids. Let's see. Speaking of investments in the future, like that obviously is, how about that Green New Deal, y'all? U.S. infrastructure scores a D from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and problems in our roads, water systems, and power grid cost us countless billions every year in lost productivity. We also continue to subsidize oil and gas using taxpayer money to poison the world and prop up the businesses of yesterday. I think it's time to invest in the jobs of tomorrow. And when we know that any investment in infrastructure brings a 3-to-1 return in increased productivity, and when we know how much our region in particular could benefit from investment in solar and wind energy, how can we possibly resist? I see no reason to cede leadership in the technologies of the future to China or Europe when we still have plenty of innovation left in us. We just stopped investing in our education and research, and as a consequence, we're falling farther and farther behind in things like battery tech and solar cell tech and whatnot. Okay, speaking of falling behind, only 2 countries in the world failed to mandate family leave for maternity, the US and Papua New Guinea. If the poorest countries in the world can afford it, why the hell can't we? And no other rich country fails to provide paid sick leave as a right to all, with the result that a quarter of US workers can't take time off when sick. I think you can see how this hurts us during a pandemic. So I want to end with like a deeper dive into what I think is going to be perhaps the defining issue of the coming election, given the pandemic, universal health care. Why is it that prior to the pandemic and the layoffs, already 28 million already had no health insurance at all, and tens of millions more had lousy plans with high deductibles and copays? We forced people into emergency rooms for preventable illnesses and into medical bankruptcy, which happens nowhere else in the world. We waste vast sums of money, nearly twice as much as any comparably rich country, and have far worse results for it. So the question I asked myself a lot was, why do so many voters consistently choose to be less healthy and less financially secure? I think we're clearly not getting the message across, given we've been talking about universal health care in some form or another since the 1930s. So in my race, and particularly running in a purple district, I tend to focus on 3 points: cost, freedom, and safety. First, the cost. I'm sure you have all heard that Medicare is cheaper. It's more efficient because the providers don't have to juggle a bazillion different plans. Corporate insurance runs administrative costs between 20 and 30%. Medicare operates at a mere 2%. That kind of efficiency ought to be celebrated, but it's a threat to Republican anti-government orthodoxy, so the lower cost of Medicare is concealed, and they scream and cry that Medicare would raise the national debt. Even giving to all Americans the greatly expanded form of Medicare in the current bills would cost much less than we're currently paying, and many people in my district would see a significant pay rise if it passed. If you tell voters that your plan is going to give them $5,000 to $10,000 extra dollars a year of their own money, you're kind of winning the argument. So the next is freedom. Republicans capitalize on the fact that most folks can't distinguish between health care and health insurance. Many will say that they love their insurance, but quiz them and you find out that what they love is their providers, not the bean counters who deny them coverage and set the prices. Y'all remember those death panels of the right-wing rhetoric in 2008 when we were last running on healthcare? Sarah Palin screaming about Democrats pulling the plug on grandma. Those death panels didn't come from any government policy. They are already working in corporate America. A Medicare-based system is more accountable to voters than a market-based system is to consumers. And the absence of the profit motive increases the freedom to choose a provider and the freedom of you and your provider to set treatment. So finally, in a pandemic climate, I like to mention that in a single-payer nonprofit system, it increases our safety and security, which is a really good thing to run on, given, again, more conservative district. The main reason for the emphasis there is that there's a massive gaping flaw in our approach to healthcare, tying it to employment. An arrangement like that exists nowhere else in the rich world. This has a wide range of negative consequences for the economy, but just consider for a moment the value of telling voters that single payer would boost entrepreneurship, help small businesses, and expand the economy for all our benefit. And in a pandemic, an employer-based system is even more irresponsible. Millions of Americans have now lost their health insurance due to the spike in unemployment. Not all are going to be able to afford COBRA or qualify for a state-run low-income system, so we now have a whole lot more people with no coverage at a time when we most need it. Heck, the explosion of unemployment is another huge reason to resent the poor economic stewardship in Washington. We now have an estimated 18% unemployment rate and climbing. Just think about that for a moment. The peak unemployment during the Great Depression was 25%. We're not that far off from it. For comparison's sake, the IFO Institute in Munich has estimated that the coronavirus is going to increase German unemployment over the coming year somewhere between 0.2% and 0.5%. their unemployment in February was 3.2%, which was already lower than ours was before the pandemic. And apparently it's not going to go up by much. Yet our government is perfectly happy to throw Americans under the bus by allowing businesses to tank and people to lose their jobs, when simply offering wage subsidies was entirely within their power and in the long run, much cheaper than the damage all this job loss is going to have. I've seen estimates that in the second quarter of this year, our economy could contract by as much as 30%. That's going to hurt. So at any rate, I tend to say that none of us is safe unless all of us are safe, and that we need to learn the lessons from these extraordinary circumstances. Granting every American universal health care is a necessary step to ensure the safety of our most vulnerable populations, young and old, and the best way to do that is Medicare. Hey, Rod, that's my little spiel. If you'd like to help in our fight to bring a progressive voice to a purple district, please follow me on social media. Again, I'm Liam O'Mara, most generically Irish name you're going to find. I'm pretty easy to find on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all that. My website, too, is pretty easy to find, liamomara.org. Somebody stole the .com years ago. You can sign up to volunteer there, and then to donate, all that kind of stuff there. And I can put links in the chat in a moment here. Let's see, cute little line to end on. You have to know history to change history. And this historian is ready to fight for a progressive vision in DC. And with your help, we'll get there. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Liam. That was great. So